Think back to the very first anime you ever watched. If you grew up in the 1990s in the United States, you probably remember Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z, Yu Yu Hakusho, Digimon, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, whatever was on Toonami's lineup at the time. And while those were some of the very first anime that I experienced, my very first anime was something much different. Hi, I'm Romania Black, and to offer some context, growing up in the American 90s, my middle-class farm family was not wealthy enough for cable, but my grandfather in town had it and recorded VHS tapes of Saturday morning cartoons to send to me. And amidst the multi-hours of collected hodgepodge recordings, one particular feature-length animation stood out. It involved a tiny pink-haired unicorn that brought happiness to anyone he ever met, and the higher powers who thought that his goodwill deserved death. But we'll get back to that. What is it about this relatively unknown series that sticks with me even now into my adulthood? Why is it not as widespread in its reach to the United States and internationally as opposed to Japan? Well, to answer these questions, let's dive in. So let's get to the nitty-gritty. Unico is a creation from one of the most prolific manga creators to have ever existed, Osamu Tezuka. That alone may make you question, well, why isn't Unico more known if its creator is one of the most famous mangaka of all time? One fact which might explain this is that Tezuka has popular titles like Astro Boy, Kimba the White Lion, Dororo, Princess Knight, Blackjack, and Buddha in his bibliography. But in total, he has created over 700 manga titles. With a bibliography of that depth over a span of 40 plus years in the business, it may not be so surprising that a series developed for children would not be remembered by the general population carrying on into adulthood. So what makes Unico stand out? Before addressing that, let's talk about the available media for the series. The manga spanned two total volumes and was created between 1976 and 1979. Finding original Japanese volumes isn't too hard. A quick search on eBay led me to the copies that I currently have, but finding a modern English translation is a little more like searching for a piece of lost media. eManga, luckily, has a digital and hardcover color version of the manga that you can purchase that combines the two volumes together. And I'll put a link in the description if you want to get your own copy. There is a prologue, and then between the two volumes, there are 8 total stories. It's ironic that the manga starts out with this ethereal decree of how important love is and how it connects us all and transcends the cosmos, etc., etc. And then we hard cut to a bitter goddess Aphrodite who's jealous and complaining that a human girl named Psyche has a pet unicorn that can grant her eternal happiness and makes her the quote-unquote fairest in the land. She then calls her son Eros and tells him to use what's basically Cupid's arrows to make Psyche fall in love with the ugliest person imaginable as punishment. Damn. However, it backfires and Eros accidentally ends up falling in love with Psyche himself. After finding this out, Aphrodite, or Venus, essentially hires the West Wind, which is a personified version of the wind, to take Unico away to the quote-unquote Hill of Oblivion, which is described as the farthest place from anywhere and completely isolated. But of course, the West Wind is the West at their job. So that leads us to the chapters of the manga. Chapter 1, Buffalo Hill. By far, the most extreme and maybe controversial of the chapters is the one that we start with. Interestingly enough, it does pretty much set the stage for the series in terms of theme as well as emotion. The story starts with Unico being left by the West Wind in the middle of nowhere when a buffalo stampede nearly kills him Simba style from The Lion King. Nearly trampled, he is saved by a young Native American named Teepee. Now look, I'm not Native American, and thus I am not equipped to vocalize what tribe this is supposed to be, if at all one specifically, or if it's an amalgamation of various stereotyped Native American tribes, but it's slightly uncomfortable. But let's be open-minded. Teepee's parents seem like a normal pair of parents that anyone would ever have, and when Teepee gets Unico back to his teepee, he points out that Unico kisses him on the cheek. like a white person. His father, though, when TP points that out, says, in a semi-formal the talk with him, lets him know that it's not just white people that kiss. He then realizes his mistake, of course, but it doesn't change the fact that he did tell his son that. TP and Unico work together to save the village from a grizzly bear attack of all things, and Unico explains that as long as he's friends with TP, he'll be able to use his powers to help him, which sounds amazing. That's when TP and Unico stumble across a white girl named Mary. At first, they don't quite get along. TP is definitely portrayed as the more open-minded of the two, as he assures Mary that he is not going to scalp her, and the two end up hitting it off and they form a friendship. It then gets interesting when the two of them realize that they are just kids and they can't do more than just kiss and hug and can't properly be in love until they're actually adults. They ask Unico to turn them into adults, which he does, giving them adult bodies, and they just end up having this mildly horny date out together. It would be romantic if it wasn't kind of creepy. TP and Mary turn back into kids, and TP convinces Mary to come visit his village. Despite one old woman begging them all to kill the girl, everyone there seems pretty open-minded, and they treat her with kindness. But TP's dad is staunchly upset when TP suggests that he's going to marry his new friend. Now, to be fair, later on, they meet Mary's parents, and while they are really nice, just like TP's parents, the dad does also freak out at the idea of Mary marrying TP. TP's mother has this insanely sobering story that she tells TP of how basically the white people are trying to steal their land. And she compares them to lions and rabbits, where the white people are the lions and the Native Americans are rabbits. And it's fine while they're kids, but once they're adults, they'll be enemies and literally try to kill each other. TP and Mary are convinced that this won't happen, but then as they're out boating together, having another date as adults, Unico says they should probably stop. To which TP is like, he doesn't take Unico's warning seriously, and Unico basically tells TP that because his skin color is different than Mary's, it's going to put him in danger, which, historically accurate. The lines, white people really look down on people with different colored skin. They hate them, and that's why you two can't get married. Hearing a tiny unicorn tell this to these two children that have turned into adults is very sobering indeed. TP dismisses Unico as someone from Mary's town learns about their relationship and basically gathers a bunch of bigots in the town together to go attack TP's village. The West Wind shows up to gather up Unico and take him away, but as they're about to leave, Unico sees TP's village literally on fire with everyone getting killed. TP asks one more time to turn into adult to help save his village, to which Unico agrees, and basically TP fights off the quote-unquote white devils until he literally is about to be at death's door. Where Mary, who has somehow become an adult as well, I guess they become adults at the same time, ends up finding him and they share this intimate moment together. But Unico gets whisked away and we literally never find out the resolution of the story. And because Unico forgets every time he travels somewhere new, he ends up forgetting about Mary and TP. The story, while presenting some uncomfortable yet extremely accurate information and viewpoints, I think I'm more weirded out by the fact that the kids are turned into adults so that it's okay for them to be intimate. In the end, though, the story is about Unico making someone happy and the horrifying consequences of said happiness that have the gods worried about Unico's ability. Honestly, this story resonates with me probably the most out of all of them, and even though it can be a little bit uncomfortable with its romantic presentation, and despite how inaccurate or accurate it might be, what else do we have with the manga? Chapter 2, Rosaria the Beautiful. This one is fairly simple. Rosaria is a princess whose hideous father is scaring away her suitors because he unintentionally intimidates them. I guess it's better than him actually being bad. Through a series of shenanigans, Unico not only helps the princess become a happier person and end up with her crush, but she saves her father from being literally assassinated because he was ugly by having Unico give him a prettier face, which then makes the people realize he was a good person. So the message is basically not to judge others for their looks. Also, the princess has this dream where she makes out with the suitor who becomes her fiance at the end. Unico, in case if you haven't noticed, is really good at coaxing romance amongst all of these humans. Chapter 3, The Cat on the Broomstick. This chapter is basically part of the Fantastic Adventures of Unico movie, but with some changes. Most notable are a sheep that lets Unico nurse her, a father sheep that tries to shame Unico for it, and the storyline with the ghost prince of the forest is a little bit different and not quite as cinematic in some of the changes that it makes. And again, in Unico's tradition of heterosexual hookups, Katie the cat, or Chow as she's known in the Japanese version, ends up meeting a male tiger at the end and they fall in love. So happily ever after, even if you're not human. Chapter 4, Black Rain and White Feathers. This chapter is what the very first OVA is loosely based off of. Interestingly enough, unlike Chapter 3, which gets a more glamorous update and upgrade in the movie, this chapter is stripped back to its basics for the OVA. And after reading this chapter, I really feel that could have been a full-blown feature-length film if they had taken the time with it. Chapter 5, A Hometown Visit. We get to meet Unico's parents and his many brothers. His beautiful mother that looks like Unico and his bitchin' navy blue stallion of a father. He also gets hit on by his only sister, whose name is Corn. Her name is Corn? Maybe the Japanese name is different when it's translated. Everything gets cleared up and we find out that there are actually these faux unicorns that are kind of like satyrs. They're called replicorns that help to take care of the unicorn family and are basically not really their servants, but kind of like employees hired to help Unico's family. There is this weird plot point where the sister overeats and kind of becomes fat shamed throughout the entire story, which is slightly problematic. But everything is supposedly fine at the end because she goes back to normal. As cute as it is seeing Unico's family and the Fantasia vibe that it has, I can kind of see why this one was not adapted, as some of its themes have not aged well. Chapter 6, The Tale of the Fangs of Athens. So there is this Sphinx that is mentioned in the second Unico movie. It finds Unico in this chapter and asks him a riddle. Interestingly enough, the riddle is asked in the final piece of Unico animated media, which we'll talk about here in a second. And when Unico doesn't get the riddle, she decides to feed him to her son. Luckily, her son Pyrrho, who is called Mars in the second movie, complains and doesn't eat him. However, something even more disturbing happens. Hunters come to try to kill the Mama Sphinx. And it's actually really terrifying to watch, especially when Unico, after the mom dies, he has to go and tell Pyrrho about his mother's death. This series does not mess around. Honestly, they could have made a movie out of this entire chapter with as long as it is and with all of the insane things that happen. The baby Sphinx and Unico run into some fairies ruling the forest, one of which turns the baby Sphinx into a donkey for some reason to punish it for its selfishness, which gives off major Pleasure Island Pinocchio vibes, and which should not be surprising because Tezuka and Walt Disney were good friends. And then this pair of fairies that rule the forest, the male one, because of course they're going to be a dual gendered pair, happens to have a fairy assistant named Puck. So did Tezuka actually influence Berserk? Not only do we get a wild goose chase involving actual geese, the two fairies, because every story has to have a couple making out, get into this intimate moment, and I can only describe this next panel as they take turns swallowing Unico. And that is luckily the weirdest moment in this chapter. Then everything rounds out, and it has a much more wholesome, albeit less intimate, happy ending. Chapter 7, One Night Only Ball. This chapter literally starts with a man in Russia being run over by a carriage in a splatter of blood as a thief runs away with Unico hidden in a suitcase bag. I did not stutter. The thief turns out to be an orphan girl who establishes as 16 or 17, so it's not creepy that they, want to find a boyfriend. Unico basically makes them into Cinderella and takes them to a giant ball that looks very reminiscent of Don Bluth's Anastasia's Once Upon a December ball scene. Did they take influence from that as well? In any case, she meets a handsome noble named Romanov, and Unico uses his power to unite heterosexual couples once again, proving quite effective. Meanwhile, the entire city is trying to find her because of her reputation as a thief. With Unico's inspiration, she ends up turning herself in, thinking her one-night rendezvous with Romanov was the best it could ever be, and she can't have a life after this. It's all downhill from here. She's peaked! And she's literally about to be hung when Romanov shows up with Unico to release her, saying that her being a thief was a rumor and a misunderstanding, and he literally rides off into the sunset with her. All. Chapter 8, Unico and Solitude. The last chapter is basically the opening of the movie The Fantastic Adventures of Unico. It's pretty beat for beat with the movie scene, except that its book ended with Venus still being mad that Unico is helping other people be happy. It ends with the promise that Unico is going to keep doing his job of making others happy, and the West Wind is going to keep not doing her job. And the manga ends there. So, with the films, there are 4 main films in the Unico discography. The first is Unico, Black Cloud, and White Feathers. It's actually an OVA about Unico helping a young girl find happiness amidst her illness. It was created in 1979, which coincides with the ending of the manga's run that same year. The OVA follows a particular storyline from the manga, but it adds more epicness in the form of Unico completely wrecking a power plant, whose capitalism is polluting and destroying a local town. Definitely falling in line with a lot of pro-environmentalist animation seen from the late 70s all the way up into the 90s. Looking at you, Fern Gully! 2 years later, the feature film, Fantastic Adventures of Unico, was released. This film follows 2 particular stories from the manga that are interestingly not connected, but work surprisingly well together in the movie. One storyline involves a cat, Chow, in the Japanese version and Katie in the English dub, that is trying to be something that she's not to compensate for her loneliness and previous abandonment. The other storyline involves the literal son of the devil, Akuma, in the Japanese version, and the adorably named Beezle in English, whom Unico helps battle their own loneliness as well through his power of friendship. Despite a few changes from the original manga content, the movie primarily remains faithful to the original, but has content that connects the 2 storylines, making it more, like the OVA, epic and cinematic. The third film was Unico and the Island of Magic that came out in 1983, but was originally titled Unico and the Kingdom of the Sun in Japanese. It also has this title of Kingdom of the Sun on the actual Tezuka Osamu website, so anyway, this film is bonkers. It is surprisingly not based on a manga storyline, but rather just involves a character cameo from the manga, which is the Sphinx Piro. It is bizarre, the animation is dynamic, but because it's not an adaptation of the manga, I would say that I enjoy it a little bit less than the Fantastic Adventures of Unico from 2 years prior, but still well worth the watch for some 80s insanity. In 2000, a special OVA of Unico was released called Saving Our Fragile Earth. It was actually a short that was one of several released for a theater anniversary and involves several famous Tezuka characters making numerous cameos. The special's plot is actually based on several essays that Tezuka wrote himself, focusing on themes of environmentalism and protecting Earth's future that he wrote before his death in 1989. There is a lot of fun with the feature films and the OVA, especially as it continues the grand tradition of content that was made for children, but will probably scar them for life. In a good way, though. If you want to watch my thoughts and reactions to all of these films and OVAs, then you can join my Patreon and you'll be able to watch them as I release them each Sunday after this one. These films are not the easiest to find, and the feature-length films are available on DVD, but the OVA and the recent special I could only locate on YouTube. While it may seem weird that they were originally on the Disney Channel of all places in the late 1980s, the fact that Osamu Tezuka and Walt Disney were close friends in the animation industry likely had a lot to do with the 2 main films not only getting a release in the US, but also a decent English dub as well. Seriously, it's actually really well done. No 4 kids here. In 2007, the company New Galaxy Anime acquired US and Canadian rights to all of the Unico feature-length productions, including the previously unreleased original Japanese subtitled versions, which hadn't been available to the US for audiences prior. So, what is it about Unico? Unico has had a massive influence in Japan. One commenter on YouTube said that their classmate in Japan was actually named Unico because their mother was such a huge fan of the series growing up. Surprisingly, though, out of the hundreds that I polled on YouTube and Patreon, most had never heard of Unico, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video. All that aside, with Tezuka having a massive library of creations, why Unico? What made this series stand out from my childhood? Aside from just being available and a product of its time, Unico often deals with individuals suffering from various forms of trauma, from illness to abandonment, along with the concepts of found family, tolerance, and of being selfless versus being selfish as you grow up. While the 80s were delivering content for kids that had seriously dark undertones, the tradition of storytelling in which children are scared into learning life lessons has been around since way before Grimm's fairy tales or Hans Christian Andersen in the Western tradition, and Eastern storytelling is certainly no different. Unico seems to strive to do the same as these stories that are its predecessors. Unico often goes around in the series granting wishes for individuals, but the caveat of their power is that it only works if they like the person that they grant the wish to. He's also able to become a beautiful giant unicorn if he taps into the love of those that believe in him. Oftentimes, the individual that has their wish granted then ignores Unico's advice on what to do with their new abilities or their powers, and it tends to backfire on them and causes them to regress back to the state that they were before. And Unico, despite bringing happiness and being a general beacon of kindness and positivity, can at times be disapproving or stern as they try to offer advice to those that they meet along the way. This is especially in the Fantastic Adventures, where he almost becomes this sage mentor rather than the poor and innocent little pony that we see him in the other series. There are 2 videos on YouTube right now about Unico. One focuses on the melancholy with the musical choices for the series, which is nice, and it does add to the series' ambiance and tone. And the other video does do a brief overview, but I really think you could do a deep dive into each of these 8 chapters of Unico. And if you want to see me analyze the movies and the reaction and discuss them in more detail, those are on Patreon. Hopefully this video starts a bandwagon of people exploring the series and the content that's available. I think what drew me to Unico, aside from me trying to figure out why Tezuka drew him like a goat mixed with a cat mixed with a horse, was the idea of this unapologetically nice character that wasn't trying to be a clown or an edgelord. Unico is just kind. And in a cartoon world where those characters are often put down as weak for that type of character trait, Unico uses it to make him actually OP. And to the point where we can't quite call him a Gary Stew. He nearly gets drowned, he gets gagged in a fairy couple's strange kink play, and ends every adventure being whisked away and tragically having to forget all he met before. What makes the story worthwhile is that while Unico may have been forced to forget, all those he encounters ends up remembering him and his kind service. Maybe it was Tezuka's way of telling us to just be kind. Because even if we don't remember every little action that we take, those around us do. They are going to remember our actions, and what we do will always have the largest impact on those around us rather than just ourselves. Maybe it's a good thing a protagonist that's selfless and so compassionate is out there in kids' media, even if the road the West Wind takes him on is constantly bumpy. So yeah, that's the basics about Unico. There is so much to talk about this topic, but I encourage you to check out the manga for all its zaniness and to watch the specials that are out there. So until next time, stay safe, take care, and I'll see you all on the channel with more reactions.